Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight we step into the narrow, timber-framed streets of Tudor London, where life unfolds not in the grand halls of kings, but in the cobbled lanes of merchants, bakers, and children at play. We will follow the slow rhythm of a single day, from the first light over the Thames to the quiet glow of lanterns at night. The morning broke gently over London, pale light filtering through the mist that rose from the Thames. The river carried with it the scent of water and tar, the cries of gulls circling above, and the faint clatter of oars as boats came and went from the shore. In the streets nearby, houses of timber and plaster stood close together, their upper stories leaning above the cobbled lanes as if reaching toward one another. Smoke curled thinly from chimneys, grey against the soft sky, while the sound of wooden shutters opening echoed from one house to the next. Merchants stirred first, their footsteps heavy on the uneven stones as they made their way to market. Carts creaked under the weight of barrels, sacks, and baskets, the horses steaming in the chill air. Wooden stalls were raised and covered with cloth, their frames set firmly into the ground with practiced hands. Baskets of apples, onions, and bread were laid out in neat rows, their colors bright against the brown of mud and timber. A fishmonger dragged crates from his cart, the smell of the river carried with them, while a baker brushed flour from his arms, arranging loaves that still steamed with the warmth of dawn's fire. Children appeared soon after, chasing one another through the narrow lanes, their laughter sharp against the steady murmur of work. Some rolled wooden hoops, guiding them along the stones with sticks, their feet splashing through shallow puddles. Others crouched by the gutters, watching geese waddle past, their wings flapping noisily as dogs barked in pursuit. Women called from doorways, reminding children of tasks waiting inside, their voices lost quickly in the hum of the growing market. The sounds layered upon one another until the street seemed alive with its own music. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the forge, the creak of wheels as more carts arrived, the rhythm of voices bargaining over food and cloth. The morning had begun, and with it the pulse of Tudor London, steady and unbroken, carried forward by the countless small acts of those who lived within its narrow streets. As the morning stretched onward, narrow lanes grew crowded with the full weight of the day's trade. The cries of vendors rose above the hum of voices, each one calling out to draw attention. The fishmonger proclaiming the freshness of his catch, the baker praising the warmth of his bread, the cloth seller boasting of colors brought from across the sea. Their shouts echoed against the timbered walls, overlapping and colliding until they became a single, ceaseless chorus. Women moved steadily between the stalls, their baskets balanced against their hips or carried on arms wrapped in linen sleeves. Some paused to haggle, their voices sharp but never hostile, their gestures firm as they pointed to fruit or grain. Coins clinked as they passed from hand to hand, the dull gleam of copper catching the sun that filtered weakly through drifting clouds. A girl trailed behind her mother, tugging at her skirts, her eyes fixed longingly on a stall where sweetmeats glistened in small wooden bowls. Apprentices darted through the crowd, errands shouted into their ears at dawn now being carried out with hurried steps. One boy shouldered a basket of apples, nearly toppling as he slipped on the wet stones, only to right himself with a grin. Another carried a long roll of cloth, the ends dragging through the mud as he dodged between carts and chickens. Their laughter was quick, their movements restless, weaving in and out of the steadier rhythm of their elders. At the edge of the market, a blacksmith worked at his forge, the glow of fire bright against the morning haze. Sparks leapt as his hammer struck iron, the sound ringing like a bell across the lane. Children paused to watch, their eyes wide at the dance of flame and metal until their mothers pulled them onward. Nearby, a cooper hammered the rim of a barrel into place, the steady thud of wood joining the music of the street. Animals mingled freely with the crowd. Goats tugged at their ropes, nosing toward baskets of vegetables, bleating when pulled back. Chickens scattered underfoot, their wings flapping, their feathers catching in the hems of skirts. A dog darted after them, barking until it was shooed away by a merchant swinging a stick. Horses stamped and snorted as carts rolled slowly over the uneven cobbles, their drivers calling out to clear the way. Above it all, the houses leaned close, their timber frames dark with age, their plaster walls streaked with the smoke of countless fires. Shutters opened wide to let in the light, and from windows women leaned to call greetings to neighbors below. Laundry swayed on lines strung between upper stories, bright scraps of linen and wool fluttering like banners over the street. The air was thick with scents, fresh bread, roasting meat, damp earth, fish, and smoke, each one mingling until the whole of the street seemed wrapped in its own dense, living breath. By late morning, the Tudor street was at its fullest, every corner alive, every sound and smell woven into the great fabric. Day, life pressed close on every side, bustling, noisy, unbroken. Yet beneath the noise was a rhythm as steady as the river itself, the slow, enduring heartbeat of a city alive. By midday, the heat of the sun fell heavily across the city, though the narrow Tudor lanes held their own damp chill where shadows pooled between leaning walls. The cobbles shone slick with mud and refuse, churned by the endless press of boots, hooves, and cartwheels. Smoke thickened in the air, drifting from hearths. Forges alike, carrying with it the mingled smells of iron, bread, fish, and roasting meat. The street had no pause, only a ceaseless tide of motion that swelled and shifted with the hours. Merchants stood firm at their stalls, their voices hoarse from constant calling. A fishmonger splashed water from a bucket over his catch, keeping it glistening in the sun. Beside him, a woman spread bright ribbons across a wooden board, her fingers arranging them by color, the red and green catching the eyes. Of passing girls, a boy, no older than 10, tugged his mother's sleeve until she relented, pressing a coin into his hand so he might buy a length to tie about his cap. He stood taller with it, beaming, before following her onward into the crowd. A baker, his arms dusted white, carried steaming loaves from his shop to the street, laying them out in neat stacks upon reed mats. The smell carried far, rich and warm, and soon women queued to buy, their baskets filling quickly. Lingered nearby, their eyes fixed on the bread, until the baker caught sight of them and tossed a crust their way. They scattered, laughing, their prize broken and shared in eager hands. Further down the lane, apprentices clustered around the forge, their shirts damp with sweat as they worked bellows and fetched tools. The blacksmith's hammer struck again and again, each blow echoing down the street, sparks bursting into the air. Passers-by slowed to watch for a moment, then moved on, their errands pressing them forward. The clang of metal gave way to the steady thud of a cooper driving hoops onto a barrel, the rhythm blending into the greater music of labor. Children filled every space that work left open. Some chased hoops along the cobbles, their laughter piercing through the roar of the market. Others crouched in the mud, shaping figures from clay, arranging them on doorsteps, until a stray dog scattered them with careless paws. A girl carried a jug nearly as large as herself. Staggering beneath its weight, water sloshing over her arms as she made her way from the river. Older boys jostled one another in jest, their shouts half play, half boast, their games weaving in and out of the crowd, until a sharp word from a passing mother broke them apart. Animals too moved with the throng. Chickens scratched in the refuse, scattering when carts rolled past. A goat chewed lazily at a bundle of straw that had fallen from a wagon, ignoring the tug of the rope that bound it. Horses stamped restlessly, their drivers calling out to clear the path, while dogs prowled freely, their noses busy in the gutters, their ears twitching to every sudden noise. Above, the upper stories of houses leaned close, their windows open to the air. Women leaned out, shaking cloths or calling to neighbors, their voices carrying over the noise below. Laundry flapped between buildings, catching the sunlight in flashes of white and pale color. From one high window came the faint sound of lute, its strings plucked slowly, a tune barely audible against the market's roar. By the turning of the sun overhead, the Tudor street was swollen with life, its every breath a mixture of clamor, scent, and labor. Yet beneath the noise lay an order known only to those who lived it. Each call answered, each trade completed, each day woven into the next, as steady as the Thames itself flowing beyond the edge of the city. As the afternoon deepened, the market's energy shifted from the midday into something slower, heavier, but no less alive. The sun pressed at an angle now, its light caught in the smoke drifting from chimneys, so that shafts of gold and grey fell across the narrow lanes. The cobbles gleamed where puddles had gathered, their surfaces reflecting the tall, leaning timber frames that seemed to close the sky into strips of brightness above. Merchants wiped sweat from their brows, their voices quieter but still steady, drawing buyers to the last of their wares. A woman sold apples one by one now, the bright fruit spread thinly across her basket. A cloth seller folded bolts of fabric with care, his gestures slower, his eyes following the crowd with weariness. Beside him, a boy counted coins into his palm, stacking them carefully before tucking them into a pouch tied at his waist. The fishmonger's stall smelled stronger as the day wore on, and he sprinkled salt from a clay jar across the remaining catch, his hands moving without pause. The river air drifting up the lane. Children's play lingered but softened with the heat. Hoops rolled less quickly. Games slowed into murmured stories shared from doorstep to doorstep. A group crouched around a dog, their fingers tracing patterns into the dust on its back as it lay still, tongue lolling in the warmth. Two boys raced along the lane with sticks, striking barrels and shutters to make them ring, until they were called sharply by a man hauling firewood, his voice deep enough to scatter them in silence. Girls sat with baskets of scraps, weaving thin strips into crude toys, their laughter bright but brief before fading again into the hum of the street. Craftsmen worked on, though the pace eased. The blacksmith's hammer fell slower now, each strike deliberate, sparks flashing less frequently. The cooper leaned on his mallet, examining the curve of his finished barrel before turning it upright with a groan. A tanner stretched hides on their frames, his arms bare, his hands dark with the stain of his trade. The smells of their labor mingled with the sharper sense of roasting meat drifting from tavern doors now open wide, where shadows inside flickered with firelight and the murmur of early drinkers. Animals moved restlessly with the cooling air. Horses stamped, eager for rest, their reins tugged tight by boys guiding carts back toward stables. Goats bleated in protest as they were herded from the lanes into small courtyards. Chickens flapped noisily as children tried to gather them beneath low eaves, their wings catching in skirts and baskets. Dogs barked at one another across the street, weaving between legs, their tails high, their voices joining the layered clamor of the waning day. Above, the houses leaned closer in the dimming light. Laundry still swayed between them, catching shadows now instead of sun, the colors dulled by dusk. Shutters closed one by one, voices calling last words to neighbors before retreating into the glow of hearths. Smoke drifted steadily upward, the scent of fires spreading thick through the alleys. The Tudor street, which had roared with labor at midday, now settled into a rhythm quieter but no less dense. Every sound, hammer, voice, hoof, and song, folded into the evening, the city breathing as though it were a single body, its heart steady, its pulse woven into the stones of the lane and the slow sweep of the Thames beyond. The afternoon slid toward evening with a long, unbroken wait, and Tudor Street shifted once more into its slower rhythm, as though the city itself exhaled after the strain of the day. The sun fell low, its light no longer harsh but thick and golden, spilling across the timber-framed houses so their plaster walls glowed with warmth. Shadows stretched long along the cobbles, crossing and overlapping in dark patterns that swayed with the movement of people and carts. The air was cooler now, though it carried the heavy scent of smoke, damp earth, and refuse, mingled with the sweetness of bread pulled late from ovens and the sharper tang of fish salted for storage. Merchants called out for the last time, their voices less sharp, less insistent. A woman stacked the final loaves onto a reed mat, selling them one by one until only crumbs remained. A cloth seller rolled the remaining bolts of wool tightly, tying them with rope before loading them onto a waiting cart. The fishmonger, his arms coated with salt and scales, covered his baskets. The smell of the river clinging to him as he doused his stall with water fetched in a wooden pail. His apprentice, a boy with bare feet muddy to the ankle, carried buckets back and forth until his shoulders sagged, his movements slowing with each trip. The blacksmith's hammer rang less often now, the sparks fewer, but still children lingered nearby, fascinated by the glow of the forge. They stood close until the heat forced them back, then drifted toward the cooper, who was rolling his finished barrels into a neat line against the wall. Their laughter rose again when one boy tried to climb onto a barrel, wobbling until he toppled into the mud, his friends' shouts echoing up into the rafters above. A woman scolded them gently, her broom sweeping wide arcs across her doorstep, pushing straw and dirt alike into the gutter. Women moved through the crowd with slower steps, baskets at their sides filled with food for the night's meal. Apples, onions, and small loaves showed in flashes. The rims, their colors dulled by dusk. Some paused to exchange words with neighbors, their hands resting on hips as they leaned close, their voices carrying low beneath the broader hum of the street. Others hurried, pulling children along by the hand, brushing past chickens that scattered underfoot with wings flapping in protest. Dogs prowled in their wake, sniffing at scraps, their tails wagging with expectation of thrown bones or dropped crusts. Animals, too, seemed to sense the end of the day. Horses snorted as they were led from carts to stables, their breath steaming faintly in the cooling air. Goats were herded into narrow yards, their bleats sharp as they resisted the tug of rope. Chickens were gathered up, their squawks piercing the air until they were settled upon beams in shadowed corners. A donkey brayed once, loud enough to turn heads, before lowering its head to a trough filled with water drawn fresh from the Thames. The taverns along the lane grew louder as doors swung wide and lanterns flickered into view. Warm lights spilled onto the cobbles, carrying with it the scents of ale, roasting meat, and smoke. Inside, voices rose in laughter, songs starting and breaking into shouts as men gathered around wooden tables, their faces ruddy with drink, their gestures broad. The sound carried into the street, where children paused to listen before being urged onward by their mothers, their eyes lingering on the glow and the noise before turning back into the deepening dusk. Above the noise, the houses themselves seemed to lean closer, their upper stories casting shadows that almost touched across the lane. Laundry still hung limp between them, forgotten until morning, the cloth stirring faintly in the evening breeze. Shutters opened again, this time to spill out the glow of candles and hearths, their flames wavering against the dark. From one high window came the sound of a lute, played softly now, the tune weaving through the night air like smoke. Lost quickly in the greater hum of the city, the sky darkened to violet, the last streaks of sun fading into shadow. The Thames, unseen but close, carried the reflection of lanterns along its slow current, the water murmuring steady against its banks. The Tudor street, alive since dawn with labor and noise, folded itself into night, its breath quieter, its motion slower, yet still unbroken. The day had not ended, only shifted, its life continuing in another form, the glow of murmur of stories told in kitchens, the faint laughter of children settling at last into sleep. The city endured, its heart steady, its rhythm endless, its soul carried forward in every stone, every voice, every flicker of light against the dark. Night drew itself fully across the Tudor street, settling the lanes beneath a canopy of deep indigo where stars scattered faintly above the leaning roofs. The last glow of sunset had gone, leaving lanterns and hearth fires to shape the whir of amber light and long shadows. The carbles gleamed dark with damp, reflecting each flicker of flame as though the stones themselves held memory of the day. The market stalls, once overflowing with noise and color, stood quiet now, their cloths drawn down, their baskets stacked empty or half-covered against the night air. The taverns carried the street's new rhythm. From their low wooden doors came bursts of laughter, the scrape of chairs on planks, and the rough harmony of voices raised in. Song, smoke, and the smell of ale drifted outward, mingling with the sense of roasting meat and candle wax. Shadows moved behind shuttered windows, thrown wide in brief flashes as men leaned back, mugs lifted high. Outside, boys lingered near the doorways, listening with wide eyes, drawn by the warmth and noise though too young to cross the threshold. Their whispers broke into laughter before they darted off again into the alleys, the sound of their steps swallowed quickly by the night. In the courtyards and narrow lanes, families turned toward rest. Women folded linens and set baskets aside, their hands brushing flour or soot from their sleeves. Children lay curled on straw pallets, some murmuring drowsy fragments of the day's play before sleep claimed them. Elders sat a while longer by the hearths, their faces lit by the steady glow of fire, voices weaving old tales for the young who listened with heavy eyes. The slow turning of a spindle or the scraping of a spoon again. Bowl marked the final gestures of labor before silence settled. Animals quieted with the dark. Chickens perched upon beams, feathers rustling softly as they drew close together. Goats pressed their bodies against the walls of small pens, their bleats muted into the night. Horses stood in stables, shifting now and then, their tails swishing lazily against the still air. Dogs curled in doorways, heads resting on paws, ears pricking only when a cart creaked in the distance or a shout. Tavern! Their watch was patient, steady, as though they too were bound to the rhythm of the street. Above, windows glowed faintly with lamplight. Shutters half open revealed silhouettes bent over bowls, gestures of hands pointing, heads nodding as words passed in low voices. From one window came the soft strains of a lute again, slower now, its tune drifting like smoke into the dark. Laundry lines swayed lightly between the buildings, forgotten banners pale in the moonlight. The upper stories leaned close, their timber beams black against the sky, their weight looming above the narrow lanes where shadows gathered. The Thames moved beyond the houses, unseen yet present, carrying the reflection of lanterns along its broad, quiet surface. Its murmur was steady, eternal, the same sound that had accompanied every hour of the day. The cries of gulls had stilled, the clatter of carts had faded, but the river remained, flowing dark and constant. By midnight, the Tudor street was hushed, the pulse of labor spent, the voices quieted, the market long closed. Only the taverns kept their glow, their laughter spilling now and then into the night. Everywhere else the city lay in silence, its breath slow, its body at rest. Yet even in stillness, life endured, woven into the stones, the walls, the beams above. The street, emptied of noise but not of presence, waited with patient certainty for dawn to come again, when shutters would open, merchants would cry their wares, and the great of Tudor London would begin anew. The deepest hours of night pressed heavily upon Tudor London, when even the taverns, once roaring with song and laughter, grew quieter, their fires burning low, their voices softened to murmurs. The cobbled lanes lay almost deserted, the sound of boots and carts stilled at last, leaving only the occasional creak of timber or the far-off splash of water along the Thames. Moonlight stretched over the rooftops, catching the angled beams of the timber-framed houses, making them appear half ghostly, their shadows long and uncertain against the stones below. The stalls of the market stood as skeletons of the day gone by, their cloths tied down, their baskets empty, their wooden frames leaning in silence. A cat slinked between them, its tail high, pausing to lap at a puddle that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Rats moved unseen beneath the planks, their soft rustles lost beneath the whisper of the wind. A dog raised its head from a doorway, ears twitching, then lay back down again, its patience undisturbed. Within the homes, the silence was near complete. Fires smoldered low, embers glowing faintly, their smoke winding upward in thin grey streams that seeped into the beams above. Families slept on straw mats and pallets, their breaths slow and steady, their bodies curled against one another for warmth. Children shifted in dreams, their murmurs breaking the stillness for a moment before fading again. A woman stirred once, pulling a blanket higher across her shoulders, the linen heavy with the smell of smoke and bread. An elder's cough rasped in the quiet, sharp and brief, then gave way once more to silence. The courtyards too lay in rest. Chickens slept on beams, their heads tucked beneath wings, their feathers rising and falling with each breath. Goats lay close in their pens, their bodies pressed together, eyes half open but unseeing in the dark. A donkey shifted, hooves scraping against stone before lowering its head. Once more into stillness. The only sound that lingered was the faint trickle of water draining back into the Thames, a slow pulse that threaded through the village like a heartbeat. From the river itself came the truest voice of night. The current moved unseen, carrying the memory of the day. Fish scales, scraps of food, spilled grain, swept along with the endless silt. Its sound was soft but unbroken, a murmur as steady as breath. Boats rocked faintly where they were moored, their ropes tightening and loosening in rhythm with the water's pull. Lanterns hung on a few masts glowed dimly, their flames small against the vast dark of river and sky. Above, the heavens wheeled with slow grace. Stars burned sharp and cold, countless and still, their light mirrored faintly on the water below. The moon, half veiled by drifting clouds, spilled its glow over the timbered roofs, over the silent stalls, over the resting bodies within. The city lay hushed, bound in the weight of night, every sound softened, every breath folded into the same still rhythm. The Tudor street endured in silence, its clamour gone, its voices muted, yet its life not ended. The night held it gently, gathering every stone, every wall, every rooftop into its vast embrace. In that stillness, the city seemed eternal, waiting, as it always had, for the slow, pale breath of dawn to stir it once more into motion. The night held its quietest hour, that deep stretch before dawn when even the and the last of their candles guttered into smoke. The Tudor street lay emptied of sound and movement, wrapped in a darkness that pressed close to the timber walls and the uneven cobbles. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the smell of river water, ash, and refuse that lingered from the day. Moonlight poured between the narrow gables, striking the edges of beams and catching faint glimmers on the sheen of puddles left in the street. A cat balanced along a rooftop, its silhouette sharp against the pale sky before vanishing into shadow. From below came the faint scurry of rats slipping between baskets and shutters, their claws scratching briefly against wood before the stillness swallowed them. A single dog barked once in the distance, its voice echoing across the alleys, then faded, leaving the silence intact. Inside the houses, the quiet was deeper still. Fires had long since sunk into ash, though a faint glow pulsed in some hearths, a small ember holding on through the cold. Families slept without stirring, the rhythm of their breath the only sound in the rooms. Children curled against their mothers, their faces slack in dreams, the straw of their bedding rustling faintly with each turn. A man shifted in his sleep, muttering words half-formed, a dream spilling into the silence before dissolving again. The smell of bread clung to the walls, of smoke buried into beams, the memory of the day held in still air. In the courtyards the animals slumbered there, bodies pressed together for warmth. Goats lay with their legs folded beneath them, their eyes half closed, their sides rising slowly with breath. Chickens huddled close on their perches, feathers rustling now and then in the breeze. The donkey shifted once, its hooves scraping against the packed earth before it lowered its head and stilled again. Dogs lay sprawled at thresholds, ears twitching, their bodies tense even in rest, as though the duty of watchfulness never wholly left them. The Thames whispered beyond the houses, its broad voice unceasing. Water lapped softly against the banks, carrying driftwood and refuse along its surface, unseen but constant. Boats moored in the shallows rocked gently, their ropes stretching and easing with the pull of the current. A lantern left burning on a mast flickered faintly, its glow reflected in long, trembling lines across the water. Mist gathered along the banks, drifting low across the ground, winding between the houses until the street itself seemed half submerged in cloud. Above, the stars wheeled unseen by sleeping eyes, their paths slow and certain. The moon sank lower, its light turning pale, its brilliance softened by the thin haze that stretched across the sky. The weight of night deepened, holding the city in its stillness, as though time itself paused to let the world rest. And so the Tudor street lay in silence, emptied of cries and clamor, its life folded into sleep, its breath steady beneath the vast dome of the sky. Nothing stirred but the river, the mist, the slow turning of the heavens. It was the hour of deepest quiet, when the world seemed endless, eternal, suspended in darkness, waiting with patience for the first faint trace of dawn. The final depth of night lingered, the air cool and still, when the first faint tremor of dawn began to brush the edges of the Tudor street. The stars overhead dulled one by one, fading into a pale gray that crept across the sky. The moon slipped low, veiled. Thin clouds, its reflection stretched thin across the Thames. The river whispered steadily, carrying its burden of silt and silence, its surface dark but restless under the shifting light. The houses stood hushed, their timber frames black outlines against the softening sky. Mist clung at their bases, drifting between the narrow lanes, curling upward to blur the shapes of shutters and beams. The carbles gleamed faintly, wet with dew, their uneven surfaces catching the earliest glow. Wooden stalls stood quiet still, their cloth covers damp and heavy, their baskets stacked neatly in shadow. The silence was heavy yet fragile, ready to break at the smallest sound. Inside the houses, families stirred faintly. A child turned in his sleep, murmuring softly before pressing closer to his mother's side. A man shifted, stretching an arm across the pallet, his breath slow but beginning to quicken with waking. An elder sat up with care, rubbing his eyes, his figure bent in the dimness as he reached toward the hearth. The coals there glowed faintly, waiting to be coaxed into flame, a dull red heartbeat against the gray. In the courtyards, animals began to move. Chickens rustled, their wings fluttering as they shifted upon beams. A goat stamped its hoof, shaking dew from its back, then bleated softly into the mist. Dogs raised their heads from the thresholds, ears pricking, noses twitching as they scented the cool air. One barked once, sharp and brief, before settling again with eyes alert. The donkey brayed low, its voice rough, breaking the stillness for a moment before silence closed around it again. The river carried the first light more quickly than the sky. Its surface, once dark, shimmered now with streaks of pale silver, trembling where the current touched the banks. Boats rocked against their moorings, ropes creaking faintly in the quiet. Nets hung heavy and wet from their poles, droplets falling into the water in steady rhythm, each sound distinct in the hush of the hour. And then the rooster crowed, sharp, insistent, its call carrying through the mist. Another answered, and then another, until the silence cracked wide, replaced by the scattered voices of birds greeting the day. Windows opened above the street, shutters pushed wide to let in the cool air. Smoke rose thinly from new fires coaxed from the night's embers. The first footsteps sounded on the cobbles, cautious and soft, then more followed, echoing faintly against the walls. The Tudor street began again, its stillness dissolving into motion, its silence surrendering to the familiar chorus of trade and labor. The mist thinned with the rising sun. The houses stood clear and sharp once more, and the river caught the first fire of dawn upon its broad face. Another day opened, unbroken in its rhythm, drawn from the same breath that had carried the city through every night before. The pale light of dawn widened over the city, seeping slowly into every corner of the Tudor street. The mist thinned as the sun's edge rose above the Thames, turning its waters from silver to a soft gold. The timbered houses stood clearer now, their black beams stark against the plaster walls, their upper stories leaning close over the cobbles. Shutters creaked open one by one, wooden hinges groaning, until the lane filled with the sound of morning voices calling, greetings exchanged across the narrow gaps between homes. In the courtyards, fires crackled anew. Women bent low over hearth, coaxing flames to life with handfuls of straw and splinters of wood. The smell of smoke drifted upward, mixing with the sharper scent of fresh bread as the first loaves were set against clay ovens. Dough was kneaded in steady rhythm, the slap of hands against the table echoing into the street. Children, still heavy with sleep, crouched at their mothers' sides, their eyes following each movement, their stomachs rumbling with the promise of food. The animals added their voices to the growing chorus. Chickens clucked noisily as they fluttered down into the mud, scattering as children tossed handfuls of husks. Goats bleated while they were led out from their pens, stamping against the damp earth. Dogs darted after them, barking at the noise, tails raised high. A horse stamped its hooves against the cobbles as its harness was buckled, ready to draw the first cart into the lane. The donkey brayed loudly, answered by laughter from a boy who tugged gently at its rope, urging it to walk. The water trough. The market awoke with deliberate rhythm. Merchants returned to their stalls, uncovering baskets that had sat empty through the night, now filled once more with fresh goods. Apples shone with dew, onions stacked high, loaves of bread arranged in neat rows. A fishmonger lifted his catch from damp crates, the silver scales gleaming in the new sun, while beside him a cloth seller spread bolts of wool across the planks, their colors bright in the light. The first buyers appeared. Women with baskets at their sides, their voices rising in barter, the clink of coins marking the renewal of trade. Children's games began again in the alleys and open spaces. Wooden hoops rolled across the cobbles, chased with shouts and laughter. A group crouched at the edge of a puddle, sailing scraps of wood like boats, cheering when the current carried them further than expected. Girls clutched dolls sewn from scraps of cloth, their soft forms passed between hands as they invented stories. Dogs joined their play, barking and circling, scattering chickens that fled into the corners of the lane. Craftsmen, too, took up their tools. From the forge came the first ring of hammer against iron, sharp and echoing. Sparks leapt upward, startling children who lingered too close before scurrying back to their mothers. The cooper rolled an unfinished barrel into place, his mallet striking in slow, steady rhythm. A tanner stretched hides taut on their frames, the smell sharp and lingering. Carried down the street by the morning breeze. Above, laundry flapped on lines strung between the leaning houses, the cloth catching the sun as it dried. From high windows came the sound of voices, women calling to neighbors, men giving instructions to apprentices below. A lute was plucked faintly in one room, the tune simple, weaving through the greater noise of the street. By full morning, the Tudor street was alive again, its silence of night forgotten, its energy renewed. every stall, every doorway, every rooftop bore the marks of motion. Work and laughter layered together until the whole lane seemed to breathe as one. The city's rhythm continued, steady as the river's flow, unbroken by night, carried forward into another day of labor, trade, and life lived among the narrow, leaning beams of London. By mid-morning, the Tudor street had gathered into its full stride, each sound layering upon another until the air itself seemed thick with noise and motion. The cries of vendor fell, each voice vying for attention, the baker calling out the warmth of his loaves, the fishmonger boasting of the morning's catch, the cloth seller unfurling bolts of bright wool. Their words overlapped in a chorus that echoed down the lane, joined by the sharp ring of hammer against anvil from the forge and the steady creak of wagon wheels over the cobbles. Women moved steadily between the stalls, baskets at their sides growing heavy with bread, onions, apples, and meat. They paused to barter, their voices quick, their gestures firm, their eyes sharp as they weighed each coin against the value of the day's meal. A girl followed close behind her mother, tugging at her sleeve, her gaze fixed on a jar of sweets that gleamed like jewels beneath the morning sun. The mother smiled, placed a coin on the stall, and handed the child a small piece, the delight in her eyes as bright as the sugar itself. Apprentices darted through the lanes, carrying tools, bolts of cloth, or basket filled to their brims. Their steps splashed in the damp, their laughter unbroken even as masters barked orders behind them. One boy shouldered a sack of grain nearly too heavy for him, staggering as he crossed the cobbles, drawing cheers and teasing shouts from his companions. Another rushed with a bundle of kindling, nearly colliding with a goat that bleated in protest before scrambling away. The street swallowed these small dramas into its greater rhythm, each motion absorbed into the ceaseless tide of work and play. Children's games filled every space not claimed by trade. Wooden hoops rattled along the cobbles, guided by sticks clattering against their rims. A group of boys chased one another through the crowd, ducking beneath carts, their laughter piercing the roar of voices. Girls sat on steps, weaving scraps of cloth into small dolls, their faces intent, their conversations low and steady as they worked. Dogs barked as they chased geese down the lane, scattering feathers that drifted into the air before falling into the mud. Craftsmen bent to their labor, their sounds distinct and unceasing. The blacksmith's hammer rang clear, sparks bursting with each strike, the heat of his forge drawing sweat across his brow. The cooper hammered hoops into place, the hollow thud of wood deep and resonant, barrels standing in neat lines beside him. A barber shaved a man on a stool outside, the scrape of his blade soft against the backdrop of noise, the shave falling in fine wisps that blew away on the breeze. Animals were as much a part of the street as the people themselves. Horses stamped and snorted as they pulled carts laden with barrels and firewood, their breath steaming faintly in the cool air. Chickens scratched in the gutters, scattering whenever a child ran too close. Goats tugged at ropes, nosing toward baskets of vegetables, their bleats sharp and insistent. Dogs prowled freely, weaving between legs, pausing to sniff at stalls, wagging as they followed the scent of roasting meat drifting from a nearby tavern. Above, the upper stories leaned close, casting long shadows across the lane. Laundry fluttered between them, pale cloth catching the sun in sudden bursts of brightness. Shutters swung open as women leaned from windows, calling greetings to those below, their voices carrying high over the hum of the crowd. From one balcony came the slow plucking of a lute, the tune weaving faintly through the tumult like a thread of calm. The Tudor street, now fully awake, pulsed with life. Each cry, each footstep, each laughter folded into the whole until the lane itself seemed alive, its heartbeat steady and unbroken. The city's breath was constant, drawn from the work of its people, carried forward by their endless rhythm, as certain and enduring as the Thames that flowed just beyond the crowded walls. The sun had climbed higher now, spilling its light down into the narrow lanes where it caught on the plaster, and the slick carbles below. The Tudor street shimmered with motion, the rhythm of life unbroken, its every corner filled with sound, color, and scent. The air carried the warmth of baking bread, the brine of salted fish, the sharp tang of tanned hides, and the smoky sweetness of roasting meat, all mingling into a single heavy breath that clung to the houses and courtyards alike. Merchants stood behind their stalls, their sleeves rolled high, their voices roughened from hours of shouting. Eh? Baker wiped flour from his brow with the back of his hand, then stacked more loaves in neat piles that shrank as quickly as he built them. The fishmonger, his apron damp with scales, scattered handfuls of salt over his remaining catch, calling out to passers-by with the same insistence he had used at dawn. Cloth merchants unfurled bolts of wool and linen across wooden planks, the colors catching sunlight as they fluttered in the breeze. Women stopped to touch, to weigh, to barter, their baskets, already full, but never yet enough. Children swarmed through it all, their energy unbroken by the day's heat. Some chased hoops rolling over the uneven stones, their sticks clattering as they struck again and again to keep the circles moving. Others crouched low in the dirt, shaping figures from mud and straw, arranging them in rows before a sudden shout sent them scattering. A group gathered near a puddle, floating scraps of wood like ships, cheering when the current carried one further than the rest. Their laughter cut through the murmur of trade like bells, bright and unrestrained. Apprentices hurried along their errands, baskets at their sides, their shoulders bent beneath the weight of barrels, sacks, or firewood. Masters barked orders from the thresholds of workshops, their voices sharp, carrying above the street. A boy staggered beneath a bundle of reeds taller than himself, his face hidden, his steps uncertain as he weaved between chickens and dogs. Another carried a jar so carefully that his breath caught with each step, his eyes fixed on the surface of the water, trembling inside. Craftsmen worked with steady patience, their labor part of the street's very heartbeat. The blacksmith's hammer struck iron in bursts of rhythm, sparks leaping bright before falling to die in the dust. A cooper worked with mallet and hoop, shaping his barrels with blows that echoed like drumbeats against the wooden walls. The barber bent over his work, his blade scraping slow and sure. His client seated calm, head tilted to the sun. Beside him, children gathered to watch, fascinated by the steady fall of hair into the dirt. Animals mingled freely with the crowd. Horses pulled carts heavy with firewood and grain, their hooves ringing against the cobbles, their nostrils flaring. Goats bleated as they tugged against ropes, noses pressed toward baskets filled with greens. Chickens darted underfoot, their feathers scattering when a dog chased them, barking until it was soir. Away by a laughing boy, donkeys stood in the shade of doorways, their long ears twitching at the sounds around them, their patience endless. Above, the houses leaned close, their beams black against the brightness of sky. Laundry flapped from windows strung high, strips of cloth pale and brilliant in the sun. Women leaned from open shutters, calling greetings to neighbors, their voices rising and falling like song above the chaos below. A faint tune carried from a lute plucked behind one of the upper walls, almost lost in the swell of the street's roar. By the height of day, the Tudor street was a living tide. Noise, scent, and color surged together in unbroken rhythm, each gesture, each trade, each laugh, each hammer strike, woven into the fabric of a city that knew no stillness. Beneath the sun's weight, the life of London pressed onward, dense, unceasing, eternal. By early afternoon, the Tudor street had settled into a dense, steady hum, its noise no longer sharp but lay. Constant tide that rolled through every corner of the lane. The sun poured into the narrow spaces between the leaning roofs, casting beams of gold that lit the plaster walls and struck the wet cobbles, so that they glimmered as though dusted with light. Shadows lay deep where the houses leaned closest, their timber frames dark against the brightness. And in these shaded places, the street's motion never paused. Merchants leaned on their stalls, their cries slower now, but still they called there. Voices raspy from the morning's labor. The baker stacked the last of his loaves, their crusts crackling as he laid them on reed mats. Women gathered close, weighing bread in their hands, passing coins from palm to palm before hurrying off with baskets tucked against their hips. The fishmonger's baskets were nearly bare, the strongest scent of his trade lingering still, sharp and salty, carried on the warm air. He wiped his hands across his apron, lifting a single shining fish to display his. Words quieter, but his tone no less insistent. Apprentices rushed in all directions, carrying errands through the market, as if the weight of the city itself rested on their shoulders. One boy bore a long roll of cloth, the fabric dragging in the dust until his master's voice barked sharp from behind. Another ran with a clay jug, its water sloshing dangerously near the rim, his lips pressed tight in concentration. Their movements threaded through the crowd, weaving between women balancing basket, and carts pulled by restless horses. Children filled the empty spaces with their games. Hoops clattered across the cobbles, their rhythm a counterpoint to the hammering from the forge. A girl crouched in the mud with a doll sewn from scraps, her voice soft as she told it a story only she could hear. Two boys balanced on a barrel, jostling each other until they tumbled into laughter and straw. Their mothers' voices carried sharp from the doorways, but their games resumed as soon as the scold faded into the noise of the street. Craftsmen labored in the open air, their work part of the afternoon's chorus. The blacksmith bent close to the fire, each strike of his hammer sending sparks bursting like fleeting stars. The cooper tightened the last hoop onto a barrel, the mallet's blows deep and measured, his arms shining with sweat. A seamstress sat in the shade of her doorway, her hands quick with a needle, her gaze never leaving her work even as children passed close. Her thread glee, faintly in the sun, weaving pattern and form into the cloth that stretched across her lap. Animals moved restlessly in the thickening heat. Chickens scratched at the mud, scattering when carts rumbled through. A dog barked at a goose that flapped its wings wide, its cries sharp and indignant. Horses tossed their heads against their reins, their breath rising in short, heavy bursts as boys guided them toward the shade of stables. A donkey, its load balanced in baskets on either side, plodded through the lane with patient steps, its ears flicking at every sudden noise. Above, shutters swung wide to catch the faint breeze. Women leaned from upper stories, speaking in low tones across the street, their words carried faintly over the tumult below. Laundry hung between windows, bright strips of linen glowing in the sunlight, shifting gently in the air. A faint sound of song carried from one house, a woman's voice slow and low, rising and falling like a lull beneath the sharper cries of trade. The Tudor street held its rhythm unbroken, thick with labor, laughter, and the smell of food and fire. The city seemed bound together by this motion, every step and every sound woven into the same unending fabric. Time slipped forward, carried not by the turning of shadows, but by the ceaseless pulse of life, steady as the current of the Thames beyond the walls. The weight of afternoon pressed hard upon the Tudor street, and yet the tide of life did not lessen. The heat gathered in narrow lanes, rising from the cobbles in waves that blurred the outlines of timbered walls. The sun poured down unrelenting, turning the plaster surfaces pale and bright, and filling the air with a heavy stillness that was broken only by the clamor of voices and the steady rhythm of labor. Merchants shifted wearily behind their stalls, their sleeves damp with sweat, their faces red from the glare. Still they called, though their voices carried more strain than force. The baker sold the last of his loaves, pressing them into waiting hands until his baskets lay empty, save for crumbs that children darted to collect. The fishmonger splashed water across his boards, the droplets hissing faintly in the heat, his baskets covered now with cloths to hold back the flies. The cloth seller folded what remained of his wares, each piece smoothed carefully before being laid across the boards with deliberate slowness. Women moved steadily through the lanes, their baskets laden with food, their steps careful on the slick cobbles. Some paused to bargain still, voices rising sharp against the murmur, hands gesturing firmly in emphasis. Others hurried on, skirts brushing the dust, pulling children close at their sides. A girl carried a jug nearly too large for her, arms straining as she walked with careful steps, her face tight with effort. At her side a boy skipped lightly, his laughter unbroken, his stick chasing a hoop along the stones. The craftsman worked on despite the way. The blacksmith stood over his forge, sweat dripping from his brow, his hammer falling slow but steady, each strike ringing into the street. The cooper leaned upon his mallet, pausing between blows, his breath deep, before lifting it again to tighten the iron hoops about his barrels. A tanner stretched hides across frames, the sharp scent of his work carried far down the street, mingling with the smell of hot bread and smoke. Children's games filled the air with bursts of sound, their laughter piercing the hum of trade. They ran barefoot across the cobbles, their feet splashing through shallow puddles, their shouts echoing against the timbered walls. Some crouched in the shade, shaping clay into crude figures, arranging them in rows upon the steps. Others followed dogs into the alleys, their cries bright as they scattered chickens that flapped and squawked in protest. Their mothers' voices called them back, stern but softened with a weary smile. Animals shared the heat with their masters. Horses stamped restlessly, their nostrils wide, their tails swishing against the flies. Goats bleated as they pulled against ropes, eager for shade, their hooves slipping in the mud. Chickens fluttered and scratched in the dust, their wings beating noisily whenever a cart rolled past. Dogs sprawled in doorways, tongues lolling, only raising their heads when footsteps passed too near. The donkey brayed once, long and low, its call stretching across the lane before it fell back into silence. Above, the houses leaned close, their shadows stretching long upon the cobbles. Shutters stood open, catching what little breeze moved through the air. Women leaned from windows, shaking cloths into the street, their voices carrying as they exchanged greetings with neighbors opposite. Laundry swayed gently on lines strung high, its pale cloth glowing against the dark timber beams. From one room came the sound of a fiddle played slowly, its tune drifting down through the heat, almost lost amid the chorus of voices below. The afternoon wore on with no pause, the street holding its rhythm as though it had no end. Each strike of hammer, each call of a merchant, each burst of children's laughter folded into the same vast breath. The city endured its heat, its noise, its weight, moving forward without haste, bound always to its own unbroken tide. The sun slid further across the sky, casting long, slanting light into the Tudor street, where shadows, jutting beams and crooked gables. The heat of the day still clung to the cobbles, the stones warm underfoot, their damp sheen dried into patches of dust. The air, though heavy, carried a shift now, a faint stirring of breeze off the Thames, moving slowly through the narrow lanes, tugging at hanging cloth and stirring the smoke that drifted lazily from chimneys and forges. Merchants prepared to draw their day toward its close, though the labor was not yet done. The baker swept crumbs from his boards, his baskets long emptied, the smell of bread lingering still in the street. The fishmonger salted the last of his catch, his hands quick, his apprentice wiping scales from the boards with broad strokes of cloth. The cloth seller rolled his remaining bolts tight, stacking them in neat piles, each bound with rope, his voice quieter now, no longer calling but speaking softly to the last customers who lingered. Women carried their baskets homeward, their skirts brushing dust as they walked. With deliberate steps, children followed close, their chatter bright, their hands sticky with sweets purchased from the stalls. Some paused to play still, dropping their bundles of sticks to chase a hoop across the cobbles, their mothers' voices sharp behind them, urging them on. Others leaned against door frames, chewing crusts of bread, their eyes half dreaming as they watched the street's movement pass them by. Apprentices, their tasks not yet finished, hurried back and forth with tools and loads. One staggered under the weight of a bucket brimming with water, the surface trembling with each step until it sloshed over his arms. Another carried planks across his shoulders, the ends knocking against shutters as he weaved through the crowd. Masters' voices followed them, sharp with impatience, though softened by the weariness of the hour. The craftsmen kept at their benches, though the rhythm slowed. The blacksmith leaned heavily on his hammer, each blow slower, the sparks fewer. Though the glow of the forge burned bright still against the growing dusk, the cooper stacked his finished barrels in careful rows, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. A barber folded his cloths, sweeping hair from the step with a short broom, his work done for the day. The tanner lingered longest, stretching hides with slow, deliberate care, the smell of his trade clinging thick in the evening air. Animals filled the lane with their restlessness. Horses shifted as carts were led away, their hooves striking hollow against the stones. Dogs barked in short bursts, chasing chickens that fled with flapping wings into the corners. A goat pulled against its tether, its bleat sharp, until a boy tugged it back with both hands. The donkey stood patient still, ears twitching as it watched the bustle, its shadow long against the wall in the slanting sun. Above, windows glowed faintly in the last light, shutters wide to catch the cooling air. Women leaned out, calling final words to neighbors, their voices drifting soft across the rooftops. Laundry hung limp between the beams, pale cloth swaying faintly as the breeze grew steadier. From a room above came the sound of song, a tune hummed low, carrying across the lane until it folded into the hum of voices below. The Tudor street held itself in this balance, not yet day, not yet night. The sun hovered low, gilding the edges of roofs, the cobbles bright where the light struck, shadows deep where it did not. Rhythm had slowed, but it did not cease, each movement drawn into the same unbroken breath. The city, vast and dense, carried on, its life steady as the water that whispered always at its edge. Evening gathered slowly over the Tudor street, the sun slipping behind the crooked roofs and leaving the lanes washed in amber light. The timbered houses glowed where the last beams struck their plaster walls, while the shadows beneath their jutting frames deepened into pools of blue and gray. The air cooled at last, though it held the sense of the day. Smoke, bread, damp straw, and the faint brine of fish that lingered still in the gutters. Merchants closed their stalls with practiced gestures. Boards were lifted down, baskets stacked, and cloths drawn tight over what little remained. The fishmonger tipped the last of his salted scraps into a bucket, his apprentice carrying it off with slow, weary steps. The baker swept flour from his boards into the street, brushing his apron clean as he barred his shop door. The cloth seller tied his bolts and loaded them onto a cart, his voice softer now as he spoke to the boy who led the horse. The cries of trade that had filled the air since dawn dwindled into murmurs, replaced by the scrape of shutters and the creak of wooden frames being folded away. Women carried their baskets homeward, their skirts lifting as they stepped across the uneven stones. Children trailed close, clutching crusts of bread or small apples saved from the market, their laughter bright but short, softened by the weight of weariness. Neighbors paused to speak at thresholds, their words carried low, hands resting on doorframes as they shared the last talk before retreating indoors. A girl lingered to chase a hoop once more down the lane, her mother's voice sharp as she was pulled back, her game unfinished but her day spent. Craftsmen laid down their tools, their work marked in the dust and the sound that still clung faintly in the air. The blacksmith quenched his fire, the last glow fading into shadow as his hammer rang for the final time. The cooper stacked barrels in rows against the wall, covering them with cloth before wiping sweat from his brow. The barber closed his stool, sweeping hair into the gutter, his hands red from soap and water. The tanner stretched one last hide upon its frame, tying it taut with slow, deliberate knots before stepping back into the growing dark. Animals, too, settled toward night. Horsey. Away, their reins creaking, their hooves striking hollow against the stones. Chickens clucked as they fluttered to their roosts, feathers brushing against beams in the courtyards. Goats bleated as they were herded into pens, their protests sharp before silence took them. Dogs prowled at the edges of the street, tails wagging, their ears sharp for every sound. The donkey brayed once, loud and long, then lowered its head to chew at straw, patient and still. The taverns opened wider as the street closed. From their low doors spilled firelight and laughter, the crack of mugs against tables, and the hum of voices raised in song. The glow flickered against the cobbles, painting the shadows in red and gold. Men gathered within, their faces lit by the flames, their gestures broad, their voices booming into the night. Outside, children lingered a moment to listen, their eyes wide, before being pulled homeward into the quiet. Above, the houses leaned close in the dusk. Shutters swung closed. One by one, though some remained open, lantern lights spilling onto the lane below. Laundry still hung between the beams, pale and ghost-like in the fading light, stirring faintly in the evening air. From a window came the sound of a lute, its tune slow and gentle, weaving into the soft hum of the street as night took hold. The Tudor street, loud since dawn, now drew inward, its rhythm slowed, its clamor replaced by quiet murmur and the glow of hearths. The day folded into night. Breath, the city enduring, steady and unbroken, its life carried onward in the endless tide of voices, footsteps, and flame. Night deepened slowly over the Tudor street, gathering the city into its long exhale after the clamor of the day. The last traces of sunlight drained from the timbered rooftops, leaving only a faint glow at the horizon where the Thames turned dark and wide. The crooked houses pressed closer in the dimness, their beams black against the sky, their plaster walls fading. Shadow. Between them, the cobbles shone with the damp of evening, the stones reflecting each flicker of lantern light as though the ground itself remembered the sun. The market was gone, folded away into silence. Stalls that had stood since dawn now lay covered, their boards bare, their baskets stacked beneath tarps. The shouts of merchants, so sharp in the heat of midday, were replaced by the scrape of shutters closing, the thud of bolts drawn across doors. A cat leapt lightly from one stall. Another, tail high, eyes gleaming in the lamplight, its shadow sliding long across the stones. Rats scurried unseen beneath the planks, their claws scratching faintly in the stillness, their movements swift where scraps lingered. Families gathered in their homes, the street outside softening into quiet. In dim courtyards, women stirred pots over glowing embers, the scent of stewing meat and herbs rising with the smoke. Bread was broken, bowls passed from hand to hand, the day's labor folded into simple meals. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces lit by firelight, their voices low as they recounted games, their laughter subdued but unbroken. Elders leaned close to the warmth, their stories weaving into the night, their words slow and steady, shaping the silence with memory. The craftsmen rested, their tools laid aside, but the marks of their work lingered still. The blacksmith's anvil glowed faintly where sparks had died, its iron cool now in the dark. The coopers. Barrels stood in tidy rows against the walls, their forms sharp in the lantern glow. The tanners' hides stretched taut across their frames, their surfaces gleaming damp where the moonlight touched them. Each workshop breathed with the weight of labor finished, the silence heavy but not empty, a pause between days. Animals shifted into rest. Horses stood in their stables, heads bowed low, their breath steady, their bodies warm against the cool air. Chickens roosted above, feathers rustling in. Brief, restless movements before settling again into stillness. Goats pressed close within their pens, their bleats fading into low murmurs, quiet as sleep claimed them. Dogs lay at thresholds, their ears twitching at every sound, guardians even in slumber, their forms dark against the faint glow of hearths. The donkey brayed once, a long, hollow note that echoed into the night before silence reclaimed the lane. The taverns alone broke the hush. Their doors opened wide, spilling firelight. The Kabals, their voices rising in laughter and song. Mugs clattered, chairs scraped, and the drone of stories told over ale filled the air. The warmth inside spread outward in bursts, carried on the smoke of roasting meat, mingling with the night's cool breath. Shadows moved behind the windows, men's gestures large and loose, their words booming into the street where passers-by paused a moment to listen before moving on. Above, the houses leaned together, their upper stories casting black patterns against the deepening sky. Shutters glowed with lamplight, squares of gold suspended in the dark. From one window came the faint strains of a lute, a soft melody plucked with patience, its tune winding into the night like thread. Laundry forgotten on lines stirred in the breeze, pale shapes shifting gently, ghost-like banners above the silent lane. The Thames, unseen but ever present, gave its voice to the hour. The current whispered against its banks, steady, unbroken, carrying with it the silt, the refuse, the memory of the day. Lanterns flickered on boats moored in the shallows, their reflections trembling across the water, long lines of light broken by ripples. Oars knocked faintly against hulls as the river rocked them, a sound as ancient and enduring as the city itself. And so the Tudor street settled into its night, its clamor spent, its life folded inward yet still alive in every ember, every footstep, every voice drifting from a tavern door. The city endured in silence and in noise, its breath slowed but never ceased, bound to the river and to the endless rhythm of days. The night stretched deeper over the Tudor street, drawing the lanes into a quiet almost absolute, save for the taverns where laughter and firelight still lingered. The air had cooled, carrying with it the damp breath of the Thames, and mist rose faintly from the river's edge, drifting between the leaning houses so that their outlines blurred into pale shadows. The Kabals shone with a sheen of dew, catching lantern light in trembling glimmers, each reflection broken by the uneven stones. The market lay emptied, a skeleton of its former clamor. Stalls stood folded against the walls, their wooden frames casting angular shadows across the lane. A cloth, left loose upon one, stirred in the faint wind like a flag forgotten. A dog nosed through the gutter, sniffing at scraps missed by the day, its tail wagging faintly as it paused to gnaw a bone. Rats moved more boldly across open ground in quick bursts, their claws skittering against the stones, their presence unnoticed by all but the animals who watched with patient eyes. Within the houses the silence was deeper. Hearths glowed low, embers dim but steady, their warmth stretching only to those huddled close. Families lay on straw pallets, their bodies curled together, children pressed against their mothers' sides, their faces softened in sleep. The sound of breath filled the rooms, steady, layered, the rhythm of a household bound into rest. An elder coughed once, the sound dry and rasping before the quiet closed again. A faint snore carried from one corner, a sound half comforting in its persistence. In the courtyards, animals held their stillness. Chickens perched above, their heads tucked beneath wings, their feathers puffed against the cool. Goats lay folded against one another, their sides rising slow with breath, their eyes half open, unmoving. Horses shifted in their stalls, the scrape of hoof against wood echoing faint in the night, their breath visible as faint clouds. The donkey stirred, braying once low, its voice long and hollow, rolling through the silence before fading into the weight of dark. Dogs, sprawled in thresholds, lifted their heads at each sound, ears twitching, then lowered them again, content to wait. The taverns remained the only bright spaces. Firelight spilled through open doors, voices rolling into the street with bursts of laughter, songs rising and breaking into shouts. The warmth carried outward, thick with the smell of ale and smoke, a pocket of brightness in the dark. Shadows danced on the shutters as men lifted mugs, their gestures broad, their faces red with drink. Children long since sent home lay restless in their beds, hearing the muffled roar beyond their shutters, a reminder of the life that did not sleep. Above, the houses leaned together, their gables black shapes against the pale wash of moonlight. Shutters glowed faint with candle flame, small squares of gold suspended in shadow. Laundry hung forgotten on lines, limp now in the damp air, shifting only slightly in the breeze. From one window came a soft sound of singing, a voice low and steady, rising into the quiet and then fading again, its notes lost among the creak of beams and the whisper of wind. The river was the truest presence of night. The Thames moved broad and slow, carrying its weight past the city without pause. Lanterns glimmered on a few, moored along its bank, their reflections trembling long across the water. The sound of the current, soft but constant, reached even into the lanes, steady as breath, eternal as the stones beneath the street. And so the Tudor street lay in its stillness, its day folded wholly into night. The noise, the laughter, the labor, all stilled, all waiting. The city did not sleep entirely, for its taverns still glowed and its river still moved, but it rested in rhythm, its life slowed but never endured in silence as it had endured in noise, holding itself steady until the pale grey of dawn would draw it into motion once more. The hour before dawn pressed close upon the Tudor street, the darkest stretch of night, when even the taverns had dimmed to murmurs, and the last drinkers slumped in silence. The cobbles lay wet with dew, their surfaces slick and gleaming beneath the faint light of the moon. Mist drifted low across the ground, spilling from the Thames into the narrow lanes, softening the outlines of beams and gables until the houses seemed like shadows leaning over shadows. The air was still and heavy, carrying the smell of damp timber, smoke long cooled, and refuse left from the day. Only faint sounds disturbed it. The distant creak of a moored boat rocking against its rope, the soft splash of water against stone, the scratch of a rat's claws on wood. A dog lifted its head from a doorway, ears twitching, then settled again, its breath steaming faintly into chill. Within the houses, the silence was deeper still. Families lay in close bundles on straw and cloth, children pressed into the warmth of their mothers' arms, elders curled tightly against the cold. The hearths had fallen to embers, a faint red glow that pulsed dimly beneath the ash. Now and then a sleeper shifted, the straw rustling quietly, but no words passed, no voices broke the hush. Dreams held the households, their breath the only rhythm. The courtyards were hushed, their life gathered into rest. Chickens perched with feathers puffed, their heads hidden beneath wings. Goats lay pressed together, their bodies still, their breath rising in pale clouds when they stirred. Horses stood motionless in the dark of their stalls, their ears flicking faintly at each sound, their patience endless. The donkey brayed once in its sleep, a muffled, broken sound, before lowering its head again into quiet. Dogs stretched across thresholds, their forms rigid in watch even as their eyes closed, guardians of silence. Above, the houses leaned inward, their windows black but for a few faint squares of candlelight where some soul remained awake. In those rooms shadows moved slowly, perhaps a mother rising to soothe a child or an elder restless with age. A figure leaned once from a window, pouring a trickle of water into the street below, then vanished again, shutters drawn tight against the chill. Laundry hung still between the buildings, the cloth heavy with dew, sagging in the dimness like forgotten banners. The Thames bore the true voice of the hour. Its waters rolled broad and steady, unseen but constant, whispering as they carried silt and driftwood down toward the sea. Lanterns swayed faintly on a handful of boats, their flames trembling in the breeze, their light mirrored in long lines across the black current. Oars clinked once against wood as a boat shifted in its mooring, then stilled again, the sound swallowed into the vast silence. This was the city's deepest breath, the pause between night and day when the streets seemed timeless, suspended in stillness. The clamor of trade, the cries of children, the hammer's ring, all were held back, waiting just beyond the edge of light. The Tudor street endured in shadow and silence, its heart steady, its life folded inward, until the first pale thread of dawn would loosen the darkness and summon the world into motion once more. The darkness lingered, thick and patient, but at the edge of the horizon. Faint silver began to stir, a thread of light uncoiling over the Thames. The Tudor street lay hushed beneath this fragile hour, its cobbles damp with dew, its houses looming in silence, their beams black against the paling sky. Mist drifted low through the alleys, curling at thresholds, slipping beneath door frames, softening the sharp lines of shutters and stalls. The city seemed caught between sleep and waking. Within the houses, the embers of hearths glowed faint but steady, their warmth reaching only those who slept closest. Children shifted in their dreams, their voices murmuring fragments, while mothers stirred faintly, adjusting blankets, brushing hair from small faces. An elder coughed, the sound rasping in the quiet before fading back into the rhythm of breath. The straw rustled as a man rolled onto his side, his arm heavy across his family, his breath slow, his rest unbroken. The animals sensed the change before the people did. Chickens stirred upon their perching, feathers rustling, soft clucks breaking the stillness. Goats stamped their hooves, shaking dew from their coats, their bleats muffled in the thick air. Horses shifted in their stalls, tails swishing, the sound of leather and rope faint as they strained against their tethers. Dogs raised their heads at once, ears pricking toward the east, noses twitching at the cool breath of dawn. A donkey brayed low, its call long and hollow, carrying across the mist until it was answered by silence. Above, shutters cracked open, the first to greet the morning. A woman leaned out, her hair loose upon her shoulders, her eyes narrowed against the dim glow. She poured water into the street, the splash loud in the hush, before retreating again inside. Another window opened, and then another, until the lane held the faint murmur of voices, greetings spoken low across the gap between houses. Laundry hung heavy and still between the upper stories, pale shapes sagging with dew, waiting for the sun to them once more into motion. The Thames brightened first, as it always did. The black surface shimmered now with streaks of grey and silver, trembling beneath the faint stirrings of current. Boats rocked against their moorings, ropes creaking, oars knocking once against the planks. A lantern still burned on one mast, its flame paling as the sky lightened, its reflection long and broken across the moving water. Gulls wheeled faintly above, their cries sharp but distant, their wings catching the pale light of the new day. And then the first rooster crowed, clear, insistent, a sound that split the silence wide. Another followed, then another, until the street was filled with their chorus. Dogs barked in answer, their voices overlapping, joined by the bleats of goats and the rustle of chickens roused from their sleep. Doors opened with heavy thuds, shutters flung wide, voices calling out into the grey. Smoke rose from hearths as fires were coaxed from embers, twisting upward into the lightening sky. The Tudor street shifted, its silence falling away, its stillness dissolving into motion. Footsteps sounded on cobbles, children stumbled yawning into courtyards, women bent to their work with baskets and cloth. The blacksmith stepped from his doorway, apron already tied, his hammer glinting in the dim. Merchants uncovered their stalls, their voices warming as they prepared once more to call the city into its daily tide. The day began again as it always did, not with the layered hum of countless small gestures. Bread broken, water drawn, fire stirred, footsteps echoing. The Tudor street woke not suddenly but steadily, its rhythm rising like the light itself, drawn from the shadows of night into the ceaseless life of day. The light of dawn broadened, spilling fully into the Tudor street, dissolving the mist that clung to the beams and corbels. The houses emerged sharp once more, their plaster walls pale, their timber frames dark and heavy against brightness. Dew shone on every surface, on the laundry sagging between windows, on the carts waiting at the edges of the lane, on the baskets stacked neatly beside shuttered stalls. The first warmth of the sun touched the roofs, gilding their slates, before slipping downward into the narrow ways below. The street filled quickly with sound. Doors creaked open, bolts drawn back, the heavy thud of wood against plaster echoing from house to house. Women stepped into the lanes, baskets balanced on their hips, voices rising as they called greetings to neighbors. Their skirts brushed across the damp stones, the hems darkened with dew as they moved steadily toward the market. Children tumbled out behind them, their laughter high and quick, their bare feet slapping against the corbels. They darted toward puddles left by the night, stamping until water splashed into the air, their mothers' calls sharp but softened by the smile in their voices. Merchants uncovered their stalls, the cloths pulled back to reveal the day's goods. Apples shone red and gold, stacked in neat heaps. Onions filled baskets to the brim, their papery skins catching the light. Loaves of bread steamed faintly, the crust split open from the morning's bake, their smell rich and warm in the cool air. The fishmonger poured water across his boards, arranging gleaming bodies in rows, their scales flashing silver as he worked. Cloth sellers unfurled bolts of wool and linen, draping them across planks, right against the grey timber walls. Their voices rose, first tentative, then stronger, calling their wares into the hum of the lane. The craftsmen stirred as well. The blacksmith lit his forge, the smoke rising dark and sharp into the new sky. His hammer struck iron, the first clear note ringing across the street, startling children who shrieked in laughter before running off again. The cooper rolled a barrel into place, the mallet thudding against wood in steady rhythm. A barber unfolded stool, setting his blade carefully upon a cloth, waiting for the first customer to sit. The sound of work joined the sound of trade, each blending until the whole lane hummed like a great instrument. Animals were loosed into the light. Chickens fluttered down from their beams, scattering feathers as they clucked and scratched at the corbels. Goats were led from pens, their hooves slipping in the damp, their bleats rising loud as they pulled against ropes. Horses stamped and snorted as carts were harnessed, the drivers' voices low and steady as they checked straps and reins. Dogs bounded into the street, tails high, barking at chickens, chasing children, weaving between legs without care. The donkey brayed, long and hollow, as if to announce the day in its own right, answered by laughter from the boys who tugged at its rope. Above, the upper stories came alive. Shutters swung wide, laundry shaken free of dew, water poured from jugs into the street below. Women leaned from speaking across the gaps, their words carried lightly on the morning air. A boy perched on a sill, swinging his legs, watching the movement below with sleepy eyes. From one house, a lute was plucked in soft rhythm, a tune rising slowly, almost hidden beneath the swelling noise of the market. By the time the sun had climbed above the roofs, the Tudor street pulsed with life once more. The silence of night was forgotten, replaced by the layered chorus of voices, footsteps, and labor. Each folded into the next, hammer against iron, children's laughter, merchants' cries, the lowing of beasts, until the street breathed as a single body. its rhythm unbroken, its pulse steady as the river flowing endlessly beyond its walls. The sun climbed higher, spilling bright light into every corner of the Tudor street, dissolving the last traces of mist. Shadows shrank back beneath the beams and gables, leaving the corbels clear and sharp, their uneven stones glistening where dew still clung. Houses stood close and tall, their upper stories leaning as though whispering to one another, their plaster walls already streaked with smoke and age. The air was warmer now, thick with the mingled scents of bread, smoke, damp straw, and the salt of fish carried in from the river. The market reached its full voice once more. Merchants called steadily, their cries weaving together until they became a chorus that filled the lane. The baker lifted loaves still steaming from their ovens, stacking them high before eager hands carried them away. The fishmonger spread his catch across boards wet with water, the scales flashing bright in the sunlight. The cloth seller held up lengths of wool dyed red and blue, the fabric catching light as he draped it across his stall. Women bartered with sharp voices, coins clinking, baskets filling heavy with the weight of food. Children rushed through the press, their games loud and unbroken. Hoops rattled across the corbels, wooden sticks clattering in. Rhythm! A boy crouched to float a scrap of wood in a gutter stream, watching it spin away with glee before chasing after it. Girls clutched dolls sewn from scraps, their faces intent as they sat together on steps, weaving stories into their play. Dogs darted in and out of their games, barking, scattering chickens that flapped noisily before returning to scratch in the dust. Craftsmen bent to their work, their labor the steady undertone of the day. The blacksmith's hammer struck again and again, sparks bursting into the bright air before vanishing. The cooper rolled a finished barrel into place, its hollow thud ringing deep against the stones. The barber bent over a man seated on his stool, the scrape of his blade soft beneath the roar of the street. From an upper room, a seamstress leaned over her work, the needle glinting in the light, her hands quick and certain as the thread slipped through the cloth. Animals filled the street with their voices. Horses pulled carts heavy with firewood and barrels, their hooves ringing against the stones, their breath steaming faintly even in the warmth. Goats tugged at ropes, bleating, their heads nosing toward baskets piled high with greens. Chickens scattered whenever footsteps drew too close, their feathers catching in the air. A donkey brayed long and loud, its call answered by the laughter of boys who followed behind, tugging lightly at its rope. Above, the houses added their own voices to the chorus. Shutters stood open wide. Women leaning out to call across the narrow gap, their greetings lost quickly in the roar below. Laundry fluttered on high lines, pale cloth shifting against the brightness. From one window a boy tossed scraps to the street, dogs leaping to snatch them while children laughed at the sight. A lute's faint song drifted into the air, its tune light, almost hidden beneath the hum of the market. By midday the Tudor street was at its height, every stall alive, every workshop busy, every alley with children's laughter. The silence of night, the stillness of dawn were long forgotten, folded into the ceaseless breath of the city. The street pulsed as one body, its heart steady, its rhythm unbroken, its life as certain as the slow current of the Thames. And as the sun burned high above the rooftops, the day pressed onward, part of a cycle endless and eternal, the same rhythm that would carry the city through countless mornings yet to come.